You've been an inspiration for me in my leadership journey. And I don't know if I've told you this, Muriel, but when I went to Cambodia, you came with me. You were sitting on my shoulder, advising me about how to work cross-culturally the whole way through. So I really want to acknowledge and thank you for the leadership that you've demonstrated across the child and family welfare sector. You've been the CEO at VACA for over 20 years. 20 years now. You've been the chair of SNAKE. You've been acknowledged for your leadership in the sector in more ways than I'm going to be able to go through now. But in Order of Australia, you're on the honour roll in Victoria. You're on the Aboriginal honour roll, inducted into that more recently. You've been awarded an honorary Doctor of Laws and Social Work from La Trobe, and honorary laws from Sydney University. So you've been acknowledged for the leadership you've shown in the sector by many people. So my first question is leading out of a conversation that you and I have had a number of times about your mother and what you've learnt about leadership from your mother and the strong women in your family.
Yeah, look, thank you very much for having, as is always my tradition, I just want to acknowledge all the lands that we are on today and acknowledge elders and past and present and emerging. My people are Yorta Yorta and Jarjarong, Boonwurrung and Toongarong, and so I'm probably one of the very fortunate ones in Victoria that has, really still kept strong links. But in talking to, about today, about the person that kept those strong links, and it was my mum. And I think my mum had to overcome some huge, really big issues, both by dad and mum. My dad was born on Lake Tyers mission. He was put off the mission when he was 14 because he had fair skin. He was the oldest of 13 children. And my grandmother really, really struggled when my dad was put off the mission because he was the one that took on the parenting role, because most of the men had to leave the mission to work. And so it was heartbreaking for my dad, but also for my mum. I can't imagine, I've got 14-year-old grandkids, and I can't imagine what it would be like for them to be able to be told, go make your way in the world. So, but I was looking at a story about my mum, and it's in a book called Aboriginal Elders' Voices. And I just want to sort of just share with you some of the subheadings, because, in the book it's got all my generations of all my family. So it's got my great-great-grandmother, Louisa Briggs, her daughter, and my grandfather, Henry Charles, and then here is my grandmother, Muriel Charles. I never got to meet her. She died when she was 22 in childbirth with my another sibling with her fourth child. So she was 22. And so that set my mum on a journey, because my grandmother had died. My great-grandmother actually took custody of my mum. And so it talks about my mum talks about her story of growing up on the running from the welfare. She talks about living with Gran on the move, because Granny, in order to keep my mum safe, had to keep one step ahead of the welfare and took jobs doing whatever, cooking for people on sheep stations, and she actually had to leave her husband and her family behind. And then she talks about running from the welfare. She then talks about settling home on Cumragunja, and so she actually lived for a period. And my mum talks about fishing and sitting on the banks of the river and having talks with my grandmother, and I just yearn for those moments. And so. And then talks about the Cumragunja mission, but she also talked about one night when she was reminiscing on Cumragunja, and she said, Cumragunja, that was where my family was from, that was my home. And she talked about the time I looked up at the sky and I said, my land, this is mine, this is mine, this is my ground, this is my place, this is my country. They can't take this away. So for me, and then my mum also talks about the Cumragunja walk-off, because she was part of that, and how tough it really talks about how tough it was, people, and acknowledges those people. And my mum was always great at acknowledging people that stood up for us, and I think that that's really important. But then she talks about living out of Barmah Forest and how hard that was. And she met my dad on Hill 60. I thought it was a big hill, but it was a little mound. And so that's where their camp was and where she met my dad. And so it sort of talks about, but she talks about schooling and the importance of education. And one of the things that my mum was really strong with us about was education. She always pushed us to get an education. Every morning I was the last out of bed and she always pushed me out the door. And she had this great focus on education. And so I think everybody needs to have somebody in their life that cares about them and loves them as much. And, you know, there are many stories that I can tell about my mum. I know I went to the doctor once and he said to me, you've got the best formed insides, every internal organ is perfectly formed. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, your mother must have taken really good care of you when you were in her stomach. She must have really, provided with you the best food and the best nurturing because everything is perfectly formed. And I thought, what a gift, the gift that keeps giving. Every time I think I've got over losing my mum, something else happens. So I think, you have to be able to hold on to those special things. And so she taught me many lessons. I had stand-up fights with her, but, I never won. But, I think back on those and I think they just make you strong. And I'm very blessed to come from very strong. I had a grandmother that was 3 foot. That was ruled us, and ruled us not with nastiness or violence or anything like that, but with Aboriginal law. And so we went tomato picking with my grandmother once, and we were out. We were allowed to pick tomatoes, and then for a period of time we could go run wild, which we always did anyway. So there were 9 in my family, and when we finished the day, we'd go, and Nan would say to us, you kids, make sure you're back in the camps before the shadows of the sun go into the ground, because when you see the shadows of the tree go into the ground, that's when the doolagars come out. And so the doolagars were the scariest hairy men that you could think of, and so we were terrified. And so guess where we were by the time the shadows of the tree had hit the ground? We didn't have watchers. So, and elders taught us those and so many stories, and they're in, they permeate all that into your life.
What I can hear when you talk like that, Muriel, is the love and care that I see you demonstrating for the children and families that VACA works with, and how much your heart, that's what I hear when you tell those stories, is that love that I have seen from you for the people that are in your care. Like the way you talk about your grandmother looking after you and your mother's love and passion for education. That's what I see you transmitting for the next generation. And you have absolutely been prepared to put yourself on the line for that.
Yeah, I think Aboriginal people fight every day, and I think we do it out of love for our community. But I think what I see with stolen gens, what I see with children that are in the child protection system, it is about inequality, inequity, inability to understand what it is that there's a service system out there that's for everybody, not just for the people that are rich or the people that know about the services. And so it does worry me that our people don't think they have a right to services and supports, and that they don't feel that, or they feel that they'll be judged by a service. And so there's been so many learnings that I've learned at VACA. But the worst one is, I think, and the most challenging was when I started VACA, was around the absence of culture in our work. And so we were, doing child welfare, but we were doing it like everybody else. And we weren't making a difference. And we had kids that, were really struggling. And then we really identified that the thing that they were really most hungry for was the cultural base. Most of these kids didn't know who they were, didn't know where they'd come from, had no experience of Aboriginal culture. And, we would do our NAIDOC activities, and we'd bring kids in once a year, and that was it. And then, Christmas time, we'd have, Aboriginal Christmas, and we'd do that. But then we found out that we would just, we needed to do more. So in child welfare now, we're doing cultural support planning, we're doing return to country, we're doing lots of camps for kids on culture, and so developing lots of resources and materials. And we've set up the Deadly portal so kids can go into that and learn about their Aboriginal culture and know where they come from. But, some of the most exciting things are about seeing the changes in children and young people when they've gone and put their feet on their own country and they've learnt the history of their people and what their people have contributed. And I think they're the most, for me, the proudest moments working with VACA is seeing Aboriginal kids walk away. I think the hardest case for me was when an 18-year-old left our care and then came knocking on the door and said, can you do a reunion with my father, because we run the link-up program for stolen gems. He wanted to meet his Aboriginal father. Now, why couldn't we do that? All those years he was in child protection. Why did no one think it was important that he should know his Aboriginal father? So I think, those are the things that leave an indelible mark on your mind.
Yeah, they do. And you've led some of the transformation of a whole range of the mainstream services as well around what it is that they need to do, and calling them to account about how they care for Aboriginal children and families. I'm curious, so I'm leaving the script a bit in terms of the questions we talked about, Muriel, but what you've talked about bringing culture to service delivery. If you think about bringing culture to family violence services, what is it that you've learnt about how to do that well?
Look, I think in the family violence space, we've had, strategies within Victoria, and so we've had various 10-year strategies. We've just come off one 10-year strategy. We've just started the new Jaljar strategy, and I think Aboriginal people for a long time have known what can work and what we need to do. There's been just a real lack of real systemic approach and institutional, and so they tend to, it's tended to be drip-fed around, we'll give you some funding and you can, do a march or you can do T-shirts. But what we've seen is a real change institutionally and systemically now. There's a better engagement and understanding that Aboriginal people not only need to be recipients of the service systems or, have professionals on one side of the table and not see Aboriginals as professionals. And so we have now Aboriginal people working at the Orange Doors. We have Aboriginal people that are working with across the whole service system. And since that's happened, we have Aboriginal people now working with the police around response. We have Aboriginal people in the courts looking at family violence and looking at, informing magistrates about family violence. So we see now a lot of the Aboriginal people are much more comfortable in the system. What's interesting is the concern we have is the high levels of Aboriginal women that are having violence perpetrated by non-Aboriginal men. And so 85% of Aboriginal women presenting to VACA, the violence is perpetrated by a non-Aboriginal man. And so some of our thinking is that what is the view of non-Aboriginal men, of women that particularly about women, that they can think of them as less than. And so do we need to do work with women rather than only just do work with men as perpetrators? And so how do we work with women around behaviour change, about thinking, I deserve better than this, I don't deserve. And sometimes when you come from a history of violence and neglect and abuse, sometimes there's an expectation that is a form of, love. And I think we've got to rethink our Aboriginal community around what are the concepts of family violence. But we do, look, and we're not saying that we're not innocent in this. And I mean, the impact of violence on children is significant. We know that at the moment, 72% of children come into care because of family violence. And so we know that we need to do some work around what that looks like. And so a lot of our leadership is around how do we actually understand the triggers for violence? How do we actually work around intervention? How do we work with both men, women and children around trauma responses and healing and treatment? Not just saying, we're going to, you've got to, change your behaviour. And often, it relates to addressing drug and alcohol issues, addressing homelessness, housing, joblessness, all those sort of things are really, and so taking a whole of family approach to family violence. I think we've seen leadership by men and standing up. Aboriginal men, a lot of Aboriginal men now are making statements and saying it's not on. And I think that's really been significant in the Aboriginal community. I think a couple of men have done it and felt really uncomfortable afterwards, because a lot of people sort of, they felt that they, a bit uncomfortable, but not in themselves for doing it, but, uncomfortable because of the way it was reacted to by the community. So I think that we now see, a lot more women are getting a better sense of what it is that they can do about family violence. And I think that's what we want. I think the whole community wants. But we've got grandmothers standing up, we've got young women, we've got elders, I think, and we've got men, we've got young men. We're getting programs and services, and we're actually taking it up to government about what we can change.
And Muriel, you've talked about the need for change in culture and change in your people in your community, but what we're seeing is a recognition with the Black Lives Matters, the level of grief and outrage and anger that's been pouring out from people after the death of George Floyd, but how much it's resonated with what's happening here in Australia, and the impact of that. A whole lot of particularly young people I've talked to have talked about understanding now about the level of racism that Aboriginal experience in a way that they never did before. And one of the quotes that really has stood out for me in one of the articles that I read was about, yes, COVID is terrible, but my life has been a pandemic of racism. What's your what's your reflections on what it is that we can learn at this moment, and in terms of change and the impact that it's having on your community?
Look, I think really important out of this is not to walk away and let it, the Black Lives Matter just be a campaign and we march in the street and then tomorrow we'll get on with COVID, and we'll forget. And so I think that the fact that there are still vigils being held in Australia and activities still proposed, and so I think it goes to the fact that we definitely want to see action. And I think that there are different ways that people are thinking about it, and how do we actually think about, what is the role of the media, what is the role of society, and do we take it up? How do we get government to actually recognise this, but how do we get broader society? It's very much on people, it's raised the level, but it's opportune time to say, well, what are we going to do about it? Because I think that people are sort of looking for, well, who's going to lead us out of this?
Yes.
Where's the leadership going to come in Australia from? Clearly, what's concerning is the Prime Minister doesn't think we have a problem. So that's a bit concerning, because if you can't own it, what we need to do is own it. And if you look at, we've lost 432 lives since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Death in Custody was held, and they made 259 recommendations. And as I heard someone speak about today, it's about, if you thought about those recommendations, if you thought about all of the inquiries, Aboriginal people have been sat through inquiry after inquiry. We had so many hopes that, White Australia would change the way it thought about its policy towards Aboriginal people, that the system would change. And it seems to me that, you get really good people that are really focused, and then all of a sudden they move on to something else. And so we get, obviously, a lot of those things fall out. But if you think about the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and many of what Aboriginal people poured into that was, I believe, that combined with looking at the recommendation from the Royal Commission to Aboriginal Deaths, because they also included institutional abuse, racism, systemic racism, and they looked at a lot of areas that needed to be addressed in order to, address the issue of, Aboriginal people deaths in custody. But I think what was striking from, I guess, the George Floyd case was the striking similarity with one particular case here in Australia, where a young man was held down And he kept saying, I can't breathe and I can't breathe.
Yes.
And that, cases, nobody was charged, and it was so similar. And what is it about our system that can't charge somebody for doing something wrong to an Aboriginal person? Why is it? Is it a system that's so skewed? It's so skewed towards the white people of Australia rather than to the right, doing the right thing and the just thing. And so I think in going forward, I think we would want to know that we can address racial equity, and address systemic equity, and look at how do we address institutional and all of the elements of racism, because racism isn't people's. When you say racism, everybody thinks, oh, it's hate. It's based on hate. Racism is based on hate. It's not as clear cut as that. It's not always just based on, because when I say racism, immediate people get cringe and sort of think, I'm not racist. But it fails to pick up the privileges that you have as a white person, and so fails to understand how emotionally, how you interact with the world so differently when you don't have to think about your colour or think about anything to do, and I think that until we can move away from racism not being about hate, it's just about what racism privileges you, and how that sets you up to a different way of life, and to the privileges that gives you. And I think that there's certainly some of the things that I think that we need to think of going forward.
And I think thinking about the audience that we're talking to, the family violence leaders, and what it is that they need to be thinking about what we each need to confront about our own racism. Because you're right, there are moments that throughout my life I've kind of suddenly realised the biases that you grow up with, and being able to own and acknowledge and think those through, and how they impact on your leadership and the decisions that you make and the way you operate is a fundamental task for all leaders. And clearly something that in Australia we have an awful lot more work to do on.
Yeah, and I think you raised that point. I think it's you view the world through your culture and through a whole different prism of what Aboriginal people would see it. And so I live, eat, drink, sleep Aboriginal, but I'm mindful of the fact that I live in a very multicultural Australia, and so but to see at the Black Lives Matter march, it wasn't only Aboriginal people that were marching. There were Sudanese, there were so New Zealand Maoris, there was, and you could see that people, really do struggle with the element of being different in Australia. And so it is about how do we think about it. And I think Victoria is a lot better than other states. I lived in Queensland for a period of time. The level of racism that I saw up there was quite horrific, and particularly where you have a policy framework and a government framework and that works against Aboriginal people. And so it was a constant. You just couldn't see. You felt like beating your head against the wall. And so and I think that when you have ministers and governments that get it, I remember Jenny McArthur, when she started as Minister for Children, she had a real commitment to Aboriginal, and it took people a long time to get used to her prioritising and preferencing Aboriginal. And at times I felt a little bit uncomfortable in the room because, most of her speeches were about Aboriginal, and you would look around the room and you could sort of think, I wonder if everybody's as comfortable with, I felt very happy but you do sort of, she did have a great focus, and she changed the world for us. She really did. Her investment in family violence, her investment in, so many areas. She challenged it. And the department was prepared to put, things on the line. Guardianship, we've now got guardianship of hundreds of children. People thought we wouldn't get past 10, and now, the results are outstanding. And so Aboriginal people can leave, and that's what I think in the family violence system. It is about not being complacent about just accepting the status quo. How do we challenge the system to be able to change it? What can Aboriginal people deliver on? What can they do better? How can we change it? And we know that if you gave the same bucket of money to Aboriginal organisations that goes out for family violence, would they do it exactly the same way? No, probably not. They'd probably think about different ways of doing it.
Muriel, because I know you've got to go and we've got to finish up, but one of the things that was reflected back to me in looking at the orange doors was how much we have to learn from Aboriginal controlled organisations about integrated practice. And you raised it before. Family violence is about homelessness, education, health. So it's much more core to the way you think, lead, operate, is that people's lives are integrated already. It's the service system that isn't integrated, and how do we do better at that? So you're already demonstrating and providing models for how things can be done better.
Yeah, look, and I think that's been core to the work. I've been back there for 20 years. When I first started, the language was domestic violence. And I remember going to numerous forums on family violence, and they don't call it domestic violence, it's family violence, because you can't say that the man just, does this to the woman because, it happens to the kids, and we're all involved. I get involved as the mother, I get involved as the auntie, the grandparents, we're all involved in this. Understand that it impacts on everybody. And so it's done it, and then, we really sort of evolved it. And I think part of the struggle that we had, it was always, aligned to the feminist, and that we had to have a feminist view about, protecting women. And that often went... In Australia, there's, a lot of, it's aligned to the feminist thinking, but Aboriginal women don't see ourselves as leaving our men behind, and the men, we want to hold our men accountable. And so it's not about saying we don't want to protect ourselves, but we don't want that we don't have an approach that doesn't include men. Men we have to hold our men, and we're the women, we're the bosses. Men will listen to us.
Anybody who doesn't know that you're the boss, Muriel, hasn't spent much time with you.
The thing is that women have the influence to change, and the capacity to change, more capacity to change the way, the outcomes of what's happening with men. But we do need our men as well with us. It's not men over women or women over men. It's equitable in Aboriginal communities, and I think people often, and we get perplexed when people say, well, it's a feminist issue and you only have to think about, the women at it. But we can't think, and particularly, in child welfare, how do you work around family violence and work without addressing, women will often make the choice to stay with the man. Well, if we cannot do the work with that man, we cannot then get her to understand he's not going to change, then we do need to be able to work with both of them.
Yeah, and Muriel, that's not a contradiction for me in terms of what feminist leadership is about. It's about women being held equal, about Aboriginal people being held equal, and working with the whole community. And men are central to that. Men are central to how are we going to, because you're right, my first experience working in family violence was as a young 23-year-old, I think, being surprised to realise just how women would make choices to go back, and they would choose their men and their children over their own safety. Feminist leadership has to be about bringing everyone along.
But most Aboriginal people would say the reason that we have so much violence from our men is because they've been subjected to, they don't have jobs, they don't have status, often the same status. Our Aboriginal men were leaders, they were hunters, they were gatherers, they were, they held a special status in Aboriginal family way of life. You take that away and all of a sudden, women are still, they're still the main players in the house, they still the bosses, still running the house and still very strong in matriarchal ways. But patriarchal has, had to evolve and change to a different way. And our Aboriginal men, many men have transitioned to a different way. But how do you take a very hunter-gatherer style and change it into a Western construct of working as a CEO or doing things differently? And I think that's been the challenge. And history has put our men down quite and held our men back more than they've held back women.
I think patriarchy is not good for a lot of men as much as it is not good for most women. So, yeah. Muriel, thank you so much for your time. It's a really interesting conversation and I could keep going, but I know we need to finish up. So let's continue it at some other point. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.